Jason Vidrine is going to talk about the 275th years of the Védrines. And as y'all all know, I'm sure everyone knows him. He's originally from Evangeline Parish, and he's in Crowley right now, and he does a lot of work and a lot of genealogy on the Vidrine family and everything else. So, Father Jason, take it away.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. It's good to be here this morning. It's only in Ville Platte, Evangeline Parish, that a Vidrine giving a presentation about the Vidrine family history can be introduced by a Vidrine. Bel Code, no Vidrine. I'm happy to be here with you this morning. I know many of you. I've met many of you. Maybe some of you I haven't met. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about the 275th anniversary of the Vidrine family in Louisiana. This year we're celebrating the departure from France and arrival in Louisiana of Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine, who came from France to Louisiana in 1743. So it's 275 years. Of course, thinking about 275 years, you can really go in two directions. Thinking about the beginning, right, 275 years ago, or think about 275 years of history, right? It's a lot of history. So today what I want to do is really focus on the beginning, right? What that 275th anniversary celebrates, if you will. And maybe at the next anniversary we can talk about the 275 years of history, right? Or 300 years of history by that time, right? But we have a website, the Vidrine Family website, and Mardell Sibley and I have done some reflections on 275 years of history. If you want to look there, looking at the different aspects of history in 275 years, and we're continuing to do that in this 275th year. So vidrinefamily.com is the website there. And there is some work on the context of the 275 years that we're celebrating, right? So what I want to focus today in looking at the 275th anniversary are three questions: what, why, and how, right? What did Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine leave behind 275 years ago this year? Why did he leave it behind? And how did he leave it behind, right? And those are important questions. Obviously, we know a lot of what we know in regard to answering these questions from the great work of the genealogists done in the last 40 years, right? Particularly Jackie Vidrine, Winston DeVille, Bruce Ordway, many others who really started this society, the Evangeline Parish or the Evangeline Genealogical and Historical Society. So it's really grateful to her and life and her work that we're able to answer a lot of these questions, and then it's our job, obviously, to take it and go forward, right? To answer maybe some of the questions they raised and they had that they were not able to find in order to bring it forward. So what, why, and how? But of course, we know New Orleans this year is celebrating its tricentennial, 300 years, 1718 to 2018. So New Orleans, I would argue, is absolutely joined to the history of the Vidrine family and Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine. In fact, 275 years ago, he would not have come if it wasn't for New Orleans, and I'll explain why. But as it celebrates its 300 years, I think we're conscious of the 275 years, right, of the Vidrine family. So when Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine arrived in New Orleans in 1743, it was a young city, only 25 years old, and not very much developed. There was some development in 25 years, but not much development. And it's interesting to consider, as they celebrate 300 years, the Vidrine family celebrates 275 years, how closely related those two are. What did Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine leave behind in France? I'll spend a little time maybe reviewing what some of you already know, or maybe what you don't know. I was blessed this year, really, to make 2 trips to France in this 275th year, or anniversary year. January, I went with some seminarians to France, and then was able to sneak away a few days to visit Bordeaux and Saint-Livrade and Barsac. And then just a few weeks ago, I did a priest retreat in Ars, France, near Lyon, Curie of Ars. And after that, I spent a week going from the Midi down to the southwest, which I'll talk about a little bit. So it was really great to go back and ponder, to think about, right, to see, if you will, what he left behind, and think about that, especially on this anniversary. So I'm going to share a few pictures of that trip along with information this morning, right? What did he leave behind? So obviously he left behind France and the whole tradition of the Vidrine family in France. But specifically in France, in the Midi here, this is called the Midi, literally the middle of the country, there are several communities named Védrines in the Midi, still today. And these are ancient communities. These come from probably at least the thousands or 1100s, right? Ancient communities. These are named Védrines. There are at least 6, all within a 30-minute parameter, right? I was able to visit some of those as a seminarian in 2003, and then just a few weeks ago I was able to visit the others that I hadn't visited in the Midi, which I'll show you. But the Midi of France is a very beautiful area of France, very mountainous, and really a lot of natural beauty. But in history, there was a lot of migration from the Midi, north or east or west, south. I talked to the people there, we'll see in a little bit, and a lot of them said there was a lot of poverty within the Midi, right? It's very mountainous, so it's a little more difficult to farm, although they do farm. It's smaller villages rather than big cities, right, where a lot of commerce and jobs are. So there's always been a lot of migration from the area. So we know that the Vidrine family came from the Midi because it's named, right? De Védrines. So when they lived in those communities, or one of those communities, they may not have been named Védrines, right? But when they migrated, which they did, I'll talk about, they became de Védrines, right? From that community, right? Les Fontenot de la Ville, right? Or the Lonis from de la Nouvelle-Orléans. So, de Védrines. These small communities are really old, and you can sense the antiquity of them. This is one of them near a town called Old Brioude, Brioude. But it's a community called Védrines. Yeah, maybe be able to see a little better. There we go. And this is in the Midi there, but you can see the mountainous, hilly terrain, the oldness of the things that have been built there. It's kind of funny, when I arrived there, I was standing right by this sign and began to do a live video on Facebook, and a tractor's behind me, loud, right, working. It was a Saturday morning, right? So they're still farming there, but farming is a little more difficult there. But you can see the dwellings and the homes are all made of stone, quarried from the mountains, right? And they're old. These were not built yesterday, right? There are some more recent buildings which you can see, but the majority of them are very old buildings. Some of them are farms or barns, others are homes, and you can see really the antiquity. Yeah, right. But it's interesting because these villages maybe have 100 people, maybe. Wow. Right? Very small. But look at this road in the city, in the village, right? How narrow. How narrow. So it even has roads, and a very tiny village, which tells you it was an old village, right? It's an old village, and look how narrow the roads are that are there. This is a barn, very interesting, but you can see how wood within stone, and the antiquity of it. But lots of farming, but also just lots of green grass because they can't farm the mountainous terrain. A very beautiful area. This is another community of Védrines, not far away. You can see the entrance to the town there. It's a crucifix that greets you right when you arrive, kind of a side of the road marker. Again, see these narrow streets and stone buildings. This is not the same village, this is another village, but it looks very much the same as the other. Lots of flowers, beauty. And the walls that are there are old. There is nearby a chateau in the Midi that is called Chateau de Védrines. And the theory is in around the 1300s, 1400s, it was a family by the name of de Vidrine that had it, right? Now it's no longer owned by Vidrines, but they're near the community of Védrines in Midi. It's called Chateau de Védrines. Unfortunately, it's a private residence, so you can't visit it unless you get to know them, right? I haven't achieved that yet, right? But one day maybe. But it's a beautiful chateau, and it overlooks the valley, really, of the area. A lot of natural beauty. Another Vidrine community I visited this time, I had visited back in 2003, and it's near another chateau, but a little south of the others, near the town of Lapaise. But you can see there, it's funny, back in 2003, this sign was standing up straight, right? In 2018, it's kind of leaning. But again, very much like the other communities, this one's a little more modern, if you will. You got a few more modern structures, but still beautiful old stone homes and well kept and old gates, if you will, walls. There's this curious thing built on the back of this newer home. I'm not sure what it was, but very old, right? This is the chateau right near that community of Védrines, the Chateau d'Arluz it's called. It's an old castle from probably around the year 950, but today it's in ruins, but you can still go into it and visit it. Very beautiful, kind of majestic even, really, on certain days. But the community of Védrines, one of them is right near the chateau. Chateau d'Arluz. And it kind of points to also another factor of immigration, which were the wars that took place in the Midi, the wars of religion, the wars of different clans, if you will, right? And obviously at some point this was attacked in Lapaise. And right near it is a beautiful 12th century chapel called Saint Elide, a little small chapel with a cemetery there. And so all the surrounding small villages would probably bury in the cemetery of the church, right? Although the church is not in the midst of those villages, it's near it. So I had the great grace of offering Mass in the church for our ancestors in the Midi, way back, although we don't know them as of yet. But a very beautiful old church. Obviously, there's not a regular celebration of Mass here because it's a small chapel, but these ladies and one husband who took the picture came to Mass that Sunday morning. Got to visit with them. But this lady here said her ancestors, like her great-grandfather, lived in that community called Vidrine in the Midi. So there's a really rich history and simple people still, although good people. So the Midi is here. This is where the small communities of Védrines are in Auvergne in France, the Midi. And we know that at least by the year 1450, in the Middle Ages, our branch of the Vidrine family moved from Auvergne to Aquitaine, to Saint-Lévrard-sur-Lot. It's in the southwest here. So it's a few hours drive, about 2.5, 3 hours. You can imagine traveling in other ways it would take longer, but it's not next door, but it's not too far, right? But the migration happened a lot from the Midi to Aquitaine, because Aquitaine contains a lot of big cities, a lot of commerce, and it's on the coast, right? So we know that this migration of the branch that we belong to, the Vidrine family, happened around 1450. By about 1460 or so, there's evidence of them living in Saint-Livrade in the southwest here, no longer in the Midi. Jackie's work, of course, was able to trace back to, we know with certainty, Francois de Védrines, who was born in 1580, or around there. So the work we have to continue, right, is to try to find out the link past him, right, to go reach into the Midi, I think. Let's fast forward a little bit. This is in 1790 here. This is in the midst of the French Revolution. 2 years after it had started, it had reached Bordeaux in great, fierce, really great activity. So this is Jean-Baptiste de Védrines, who is the nephew of Jean-Baptiste Lapaise de Védrines, who came here. Does that make sense? So his brother Pierre had a son and named him Jean-Baptiste de Védrines. So in the midst of the revolution, he's in some hot water because he was not paying taxes on all that he owned, right? And the Vidrine family was a prominent family, so as you know, the revolutionaries went after those who were prominent, right? Who had possessions and who had well-being. So they went after him, we know, in November 1790. I was able to find this a few years ago, and it really confirms what Jackie found out in other ways that she wrote about, but this kind of confirms in hindsight what Jackie did find out, right? So the one who is the judge of the town is saying about Jean-Baptiste de Védrines, he only speaks about what he owns in Barsac, which is the Chateau d'Oisy-Védrines, right? But it is known that his father, Pierre de Vidrine, who's the brother of Jean-Baptiste Lapaise de Vidrine, who came, when he died, owned at Saint-Livrade in Agenais, houses in town, and a farm, which we know as Lapaise, right? So in 1790, he, Jean-Baptiste de Vidrine, at that point, had inherited from his father, Pierre, the brother of Jean-Baptiste de Vidrine, several houses in Saint-Livrade, a farm at Lapaise, and the Chateau d'Oisy-Védrines, right? We know that for a fact. So I want to center on, in terms of what he left behind, these three things that we know belong to our branch of the Vidrine family, right? So Saint-Livrade is in the southwest, between Bordeaux and Toulouse, and the Aquitaine region. And it's a town that goes back to at least the year 1100. It's a medieval city. At one time was walled because of its defenses. It had several gates to get in. This is a kind of a model that was made up by a friend of mine who's a historian in Saint-Livrade, Patrick Garcia, made this model here based on historical records. And so you could see within the town there, right, the church of Saint-Livrade, the cemetery right behind it. There was a monastery attached to the Church of Benedictines, and the entrance to the city, principal entrance is right here. So this city was the city of our ancestors that we know of, who we descend from. They lived here from about 1460 till about 1760. All right? So at least 4 generations that we have traced. It's interesting, I was figuring out the other day, I think the 275 years we have been in Louisiana is about the same or a little bit less than the time our branch of the Vidrine family was in Saint-Livrade. Right? About 4 generations, about 400 years, or about 300 years really. So we know for sure that Jean-Baptiste Lapaise de Vidrine, who came to Louisiana, was born here in Saint-Livrade, was baptized here in Saint-Livrade in the church. We know his father was born here and baptized here. We know his grandfather was born here and baptized here. And we know his great-grandfather was born here and baptized here. That's the furthest we've been able to trace back, those 4 generations. But all of them lived here in Saint-Livrade. And didn't just live in Saint-Livrade. His great-grandfather was a judge of the town of Saint-Livrade. François de Védrines was a royal judge. And his son, Jean de Védrines, was a royal judge. In that time period, they had begun to pass down the offices of judge in the family to make it hereditary, right? So several generations of them were judges in the town. And his dad, Jean-Baptiste Vidrine, was a lawyer in the court, but we don't have evidence of him being, or maybe hadn't yet reached the judgeship. But the three generations before Jean-Baptiste Lapaise Vidrine were prominent members of the town of Saint-Livrade, and they were judges, they were lawyers. They had, you can tell in historical evidence, great reputation in town. They were an honorable family. And they were attached to the church of Saint-Livrade in several ways, which we'll see. But to visit Saint-Livrade is really an amazing experience, right? To walk the streets that you know they walked, to see some of the buildings standing that you know they saw, right? They have, maybe even lived in. We haven't been able to figure out the building of their residence yet, right? But one day I think it'll come. But to go to the church that they saw for 400 years of their time there, it's really amazing. It's a curious map. This was in 1654. You can see at the bottom there, 1654. And on this map of the Lot River and the Garonne River, the Lot and Garonne, basically the area around Saint-Livrade, we see what appears there is Saint-Livrade, right? So 1654, you see the town drawn with walls, you see the church. It's interesting because we know that François de Vidrine, the great-grandfather of Jean-Baptiste Lapaise, was living in Saint-Livrade when this map was drawn, right? And his grandfather, Jean de Vidrine, had been born by 1654. So they were living within these walls, right, when this map was drawn. And it kind of shows how close to the Lot River it is, right? But many of the other towns that are in existence today are not on this map, which shows you Saint-Livrade has a really an antiquity about it, right? It's an old village or an old town. Today, Saint-Livrade has about 6,000 inhabitants, so it's a little smaller than Ville-Platte, but about the size of Ville-Platte, basically. An aerial view of, Saint-Livrade today is there, and you can see how much it's expanded, right? But I think what's interesting is you can basically see where the walls of the city were, the nucleus of the city, right? During the French Revolution, the walls were torn down, right? The revolutionaries wanted to get rid of all power that the king had, those in authority, so they raised the bastions, right? They tore down the walls. But there's evidence of the walls. You can see where they were as you walk the city. And it's grown, as you can see, around the area. There's a tower that still stands in Saint-Livrade. It's kind of a tourist attraction. That's the tower I showed you on the model. That was the primary entrance of the town. It's from around the year 1200. Richard the Lionheart was the king of England, and his mother had been the duchess of that area, so it's attributed to King Richard the Lionheart. This tower is standing. And I was here in January. You see I have long sleeves, right, with Philippe de Vidrine. Philippe de Vidrine is from a town called Montfaucon. Montfaucon is about 20 minutes from Saint-Livrade, a little north of Saint-Livrade, but it's a separate Vidrine family, right? He argues, and I think he's right, that there is no way we are not related because of being in the same area and just 20 miles apart, right? And being two really prominent families. The big difference is their family, from the beginning of being there at Montfaucon, were Protestant, and our branch of the family was Catholic, right? So they didn't know one another in that sense, when Jackie met them, right? They knew there was Vidrine family in Saint Livrade. They were always aware, but there was no kind of connection. But he's convinced, and I think it's true, that the further we dig, we would see there's probably one family of people who came from Védrines called the Védrines, but they moved apart and developed lives differently. But Philippe de Vidrine is a very hospitable, really great guy who invites all Vidrines to go to France to stay in his home, to stay there. It's probably a home that was built in about 1650. It's an old home. It was his great-grandfather's home that he inherited or got. And it's neat to meet someone called de Vidrine in France, right? And visit with them. But Philippe was with me that day. We went to Saint Livrade in January. But the Tower of Saint Livrade still stands. And also still standing, of course, is the Church of Saint Livrade that you saw in the model. Church was built in the 1100s and then changed a little bit over time, but essentially the structure remains, right? When I went in January, they were doing work on the inside, some painting and stuff. This was in January when I went. Philippe de Vidrine is there, and this is Patrick Garcia, the historian in Saint Livrade that I know. We were walking, but that's a church that for 4 generations, the Vidrine family was baptized in, was married in, was buried in, right? The mother church, if you will, of the Vidrine family. The oldest part of the church is the apse here, and that is really old. You can see preserved through the years. That apse, at least from the 1100s. And this is the back of the church, as you can see. Really great detail in the design, like most churches in Europe had. The back of the church there, this is the remnants of the Benedictine monastery that was there. It's now apartments people live in. But here is a parking lot, right? If you remember the model that I showed you, it was a cemetery, right? Unfortunately, in the Revolution, when churches were confiscated by the revolutionaries, the cemetery was sold, like most things in the church. A guy bought it for about $8,000 in those days. And we don't know what he did with it, but over time it's covered over. It's a parking lot, right? But everybody that you talk to in Saint Livrade knows that under that stone are tombs of their ancestors.
Wow. Yeah, it happens.
And under the church's floor too, because people were buried in the church in those days a lot of times, right? So it's amazing, you can ponder, right? The remains of your ancestors that are now under a parking lot. Right? It happens a lot.
Makes you wonder if sometimes they weren't better being buried underneath the church.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
probably why they did it.
So on the other side of that apse is this tremendously beautiful sanctuary in the church. The detail of the painting is tremendous. And it hasn't been touched in all those years, right?
Wow.
Maybe updated a little in terms of preserving it, but it's a really beautiful sanctuary. So it's cool to ponder as a Vidrine descendant, your ancestors attending Mass there, being married there, buried there. This is what they saw, right? This is a church that they went to and were at.
And it wasn't destroyed.
It wasn't. It was taken over during the Revolution and made into some kind of temple to reason, right? Like they all were. But it wasn't destroyed. Now the rest of the church, you'll see in a minute, you can tell over time it's been lost, but the sanctuary has been preserved. This is not new work, right? This was not done yesterday. So the church, as you can see there, is just without the lights on. Probably at one time had been decorated in many different places, but now it's pretty much white. The sanctuary and the apse remains there. It's not a huge church because it's not a huge community, about 6,000 people, right? But it's a beautiful church. The baptismal font in the church, as far as we know, is the original baptismal font.
Oh, wow.
So this is the baptismal font. We're almost certain Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Védrines was baptized in. His dad and his grandfather and his great-grandfather. It's an ancient baptismal font. who would think we're sitting here in Villeplatte where Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine's sons settled, right? And the ancestor that brought us here is baptized right there. Incredible. So this is the baptismal record of Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Védrines, which is in the records preserved by the state. But you can see, it's not clear, but it's 18 Mai 1712, était baptisé Jean-Baptiste Védrines, the fils legitimate de Monsieur Jean-Baptiste Védrines, a lawyer and lawyer of this city, and of Marie de Raymond. The parent's name was Jean-Baptiste Védrines, and his godmother's name was Marie de Védrines, his sister, who was a religious, but she was not able to be there, so another lady stands in her place, and that was Madeleine de Gilbert, apparently.
Okay.
But Jean-Baptiste de Védrines signed, his dad, and the priest signed twice for some reason. But
a good day.
so that was recorded, taking place here. Right? I was able to offer Holy Mass in church in St. Livrade for the souls of our ancestors, Jean-Baptiste's family there. Just pretty incredible, right? A descendant of the one baptized there to come back and offer Mass for his family. First time I know that a Vidrine priest celebrates Mass in St. Livrade. It was really incredible, really incredible.
Did you make the newspaper over
Do
there?
that. No, not so much in St. Livrade, because it's a bigger town than Barsac or Cabanac where I was, but where I went after. But it was really neat. There was one old man who was a sacristan who came to Mass, right? Because I was just going to do it myself. I didn't need a congregation there, but he insisted on staying, right? So he was there. He was there with me.
That's good.
But outside of the church, you see some of the tombs that they found in front of the church in the ground. That's what it says on the sign. Try to enlarge it there. So these were recouped in front of the church when it was restored in 1985. These are some of the tombs, but it's interesting because I was visiting with the deacon of the parish after Mass. He dropped in and we visited for a little while, but he said when they were just recently doing the work, they discovered tombs under the floor of the church, and he was surprised. He said, I didn't know people were buried all throughout under the church. So I said, yeah, that's right. My ninth great-grandfather's buried under the church here. He looked at me with eyes real big, you know. I said, our family, you know, who came here, who was from here, we know through ecclesiastical records, burial records, he was buried here under the church, you know. So one of those tombs we might dig up one day would be his tomb. I don't know, but this is his burial record. So again, this is François de Védrines. This is the great-grandfather of Jean-Baptiste. So the 20th of April, 1667, died Monsieur François de Vidrine, civil judge of this town. And he was buried the next day on the 21st in the church and in front of the chapel of St. John.
So you got it documented.
So we know he was buried there in the church. And apparently it was something like a mausoleum they had in the floor because his son was later buried there, according to the records, and his wife. And so they had a family tomb, if you will, in the church, in the floor of the church, which was common in front of the chapel of St. John. Unfortunately, during the Revolution, the chapel of St. John was destroyed. So now it's just a straight wall in the nave of the church that you saw, right? But that had a chapel of St. John on the side, and that's where they were buried, in front of the chapel. Really incredible. So the town of St. Livrade is old, to say the least, and some of the old buildings remain, although others have been torn down. But you can see some of the very old buildings, and what's called the briquette entrepoteau, the wood between the bricks that they use, the French way of building, especially the Normans have used it. But old buildings. And who knows behind the plaster and what looks like a more recent building, how old the building actually is behind it, which happens in a lot of old cities, right? This is Main Street in Saint-Livrade. It's more recent, but still old, but it's not a big street, right? It's not a huge route.
Where do they drive? Where do they drive? In the middle?
They're in the middle.
It's a one-way?
Nope, it's two ways. They make their, well, a lot of Europe does that. Take your time, right?
Do they have, I was gonna say, do they have rear view mirrors? Because Lord.
So,
It's not Lafayette, no.
Girl, they wouldn't be able to.
It's not Lafayette either.
Oh, by the way, just a little quick tip.
Looks like Vero School Road.
Vera School Road will be closed tonight. If you go into Lafayette, avoid it. You'll have to go on College
I'll go
Saloon.
there. So Saint-Livrade is an ancient city that our ancestors were from. Hey, Mike.
Father Jason, back to the church.
Yep.
All that area that's white, do they know whether he's painted over the old? Decoration?
That happened in a lot of churches. Maybe it started, a lot of the stucco started to fall off, so they just kind of painted over. It might have not been actually painted over, it might have fallen off and then they just painted. As far as I know, there's no painting under there.
There was no World War II damage?
No World War II damage. They weren't too interested in Saint-Livrade, I guess.
Too much mouth.
But that was definitely a part of the family of Védrines that Jean-Baptiste Védrine left behind. Just to fast forward a little bit, this is the marriage record of Jean-Baptiste Védrine, and the reason I put it here is Jackie was the first to really find out. The priest in Illinois had written in the wedding record the wedding of Monsieur Jean-Baptiste Lapaise de Védrine, right? And then he calls his dad also Jean-Baptiste Lapaise de Vidrine. He was from a company of detached Marines. So for a lot of years, this doesn't look like a P, it looks like an F, right? So they thought it was something like La Fraile or something like that, right? But over time, we were able to see the way he writes different P's, that it's a P-E-I-Z-E. It says, son of Jean-Baptiste Vidrine and Marie de Raymond, who are from the Diocese of Agen, right? And that was where Saint-Livrade was. So this was really the first clue that Jackie had of where to go in France, right? In his marriage record at St. Anne Chapel at Fort de Chardin, Illinois, as a Marine. I'll just show you that to see, right, Lapaise is the nickname he had, or the deep name he had. And in 1765, when he went to New Orleans after the British won the war and they went south from the fort, they arrived in New Orleans, he gave power of attorney to a man named Pierre Bourret, and he signed Jean Lapaise Védrine. So it wasn't just the priest who wrote it in his marriage record, but he himself signed Jean Lapaise.
They don't know where the Lapaise comes from?
Yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah.
oh, definitely. So it wasn't just a name that he was called, but he actually signed it. There are no other signatures we have of Lapaise that he wrote. This is the one.
Lopez.
Yeah, right. It's kind of like it. So on the map, Saint-Livrade-sur-Lot is here, and Lapaise is just about 5 miles north along the Lot River. So Lapaise, it takes about 7 minutes from Saint-Livrade to get there, right? That's like Vidrine, the community of Vidrine to Ville-Platte, right? It's north of Saint-Livrade, and this too is an ancient community, but it's a farming community. It's not developed as a city or a town, it's a farming community. So just a few weeks ago, I was able to stay right here at a bed and breakfast right across the Lot River of Lapaise. It was really neat to see there.
That's where we had surnames.
But we know, at least by the year 1480, that there were Vidrines who had farms at Lapaise, right, through the records we have. So, and our family had a farm at Lapaise, right? That's the farm in 1790 that was referenced to by the official. So it's a small community north, farming community, and again, some old buildings, but also some newer buildings, and it's essentially a farming land. It's flatter than the Midi, and there's a lot of farms still. Unfortunately, during World War II, the Germans started to build some buildings in Lapaise to store some of their ammunition, and they tore down all of the old buildings that were in their way, right? So you have some old buildings, but a lot of them were torn down by the Germans in the 1940s. But you have old farms. They just made their posts out of trees, right? There are more recent houses or homes, which means there's some young families that are
Is there a reason they do their roofs like
living
that?
there.
Is it because they live in the mountains?
This is not very mountainous, but no, I'm not sure.
It's interesting, because they all live.
And you can see several newer homes, but a lot of it is still farmland. Ironically, one major farm in Lapaise is a corn farm. It's ironic because corn comes from here. Right?
Yeah.
But they raise it to feed the animals in France. So it's, here is beans, I think, or maybe prunes, the grapes. It's a big prune area that they make. No, not cotton. But Lapaise is still very much a farming community. So we know he left behind Saint-Livrade. We know he left behind the farm at Lapaise. And this is a marriage record of his dad, Jean-Baptiste de Védrines. And the only reason I bring it up right here is just to show you, it's kind of difficult to read, but the wedding of Monsieur Jean de Vidrine, avocat on the court, so a lawyer in the court of Saint-Livrade, who marries, let's see, if I can see it. There it is, who marries Marie de Raymond, who was the legitimate daughter of Paul de Raymond. So this marriage that took place kind of shifted the Vidrine family in France, and that's because Marie de Raymond's dad had a chateau at Barsac in between Bordeaux and Saint-Livrade that was called the Chateau d'Oisy.
Really?
And it's
That's the
ancient vineyard chateau. Goes back probably to the 1200s. And when they married in 1704, the chateau went to Marie de Raymond, Paul's daughter, and she was married to Jean-Baptiste de Védrines, right? So the name became Chateau d'Oisy Védrines. So Chateau d'Oisy Védrines is still in existence. It's really great wine in France. It's Sauterne, which is a very sweet wine, but it's still there. So,
Go back.
sure. Oops, sorry.
That's so bad at that.
So Jackie had a question whenever she started doing the research. Is this the same home that our family had? And it is. It's not a different home. It's the same chateau. It's not a huge chateau when you think of chateaus in France, right? But it is a chateau, and it's not a residence. The current proprietor, Olivier Casteja, lives in Bordeaux, but he has it, he owns it, and he comes to it regularly, right? So we know that Jean-Baptiste Lapaise de Védrine's mom and dad lived in Saint-Livrade, but they came here to the chateau at different times of the year. I guess as a getaway, if you will, right? Some of their children were baptized at Barsac, at the church here, but most of their children were baptized in Saint-Livrade. They did have a son who was born and died a few days later, so he's buried in the cemetery at Barsac. Apparently they were at the chateau when he was born, right? So they would come and go, but this was not their primary residence. This is something that he inherited from Marie and that they owned. It's a really nice home or chateau. There's a tower that remains to it. Unfortunately, they changed the windows a few years ago, but he showed me where the window was, that a Marie de Védrine had inscribed her name in the glass, apparently with a ring or something.
I wonder if that's the one that was born in 1708.
Now, we're not sure if it was maybe Marie de Raymond, who was Jean-Baptiste's wife, or maybe one of their daughters, or maybe their granddaughter, but there was a Marie de Védrine who signed. But inside the chateau, there's been some work through the years, but it's essentially what it was. Not much is different. Old fireplace of stone, and some interesting architecture and decoration there. But Olivier Casteja, the proprietor, is very happy to welcome people from Louisiana who are Vidrines or descendants of the Vidrines. He's very hospitable. He has a great awareness of the family that owned it before, right, and is really open to descendants visiting. So when Jackie and Drew had first visited, it was Olivier's dad, Pierre Casteja, and he actually gave Druid Vidrine a key to the chateau, which Pierre has, Druid's son now. But there was a key given, in a sense, showing you're always welcome here. Very old, and this is the current proprietor, Olivier Casteja. He opened a few bottles of Chateau d'Oise Védrines for us, and we
Who's
visited.
that photo in the back?
What's that?
Who's that photo in the back?
Someone. It's
You don't
not
know.
our
Okay,
family.
it's not.
No. But it's really neat, and we visited for a while. I showed him that document I had found showing that Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine's nephew, Jean-Baptiste, was in trouble in 1790, and that it testified he was in Barsac, owned the chateau, and I sent him the information. He hadn't seen it. So they're really still trying to find history of the place, right, and understanding history. But as we were talking, he was pretty amazed because he didn't even know who his third great-grandfather is, right? Here we are talking about my sixth great-grandfather. We know, would go to, the Vidrine family would go to the chateau from time to time, and so what you're seeing is what they saw, right? It's what he left behind in frames. In January, that's why we're all covered up, I was able to visit with the Vidrine family. This is Pierre, what's his name that I showed you a while ago, the Vidrine. Philippe de Vidrine and his brother Charles Henri, his younger brother, and that's his wife Christine, and then some of their children, and his niece. She's a Vidrine by birth and then married. Then she's the niece of the two brothers. But it was really great. We had a really great lunch at Charles Henri's house in Bordeaux, and he brought out a bottle of Chateau d'Oise Védrines wine, and we toasted the Vidrine family. It's interesting because, as I said, they didn't know really the family at Saint-Livrade, and they didn't know of the Chateau d'Oise Védrines at all. It wasn't until Jackie and Drew made that discovery. And they still don't really know Olivier Casteja, the proprietor, but they want to get to know him, so Olivier is interested in getting to know them too. So again, these don't descend from the same branch as we do, but there is definitely some connection in history. But
DNA test?
we had a great, yeah, we should do that. I don't know if they've done DNA.
Right.
Yeah,
We
they
really
probably
should.
don't.
Yeah, but they do, and they kind of underhand it.
So unfortunately, you can read about it if you search for their family. In around the year 2000, 2001, they were swindled by a crazy guy who had convinced them that people were out to get them, and they pretty much gave all they had to this guy. And he was eventually prosecuted, and he's still in jail. But they had a chateau that was ancient, and they had other homes, and they had lots of money, and it all went to this crazy guy who convinced them. It's a movie, really, could be made about their story, but it made the headlines for years in France. But in October, when we're going to be having our reunion, the judge is going to be looking at the case once more. There was an appeal, and they may be able to get their chateau back.
Well, good.
But it's really a tragic story about their family, but you can read about it in Google.
Who's that picture that's on the wall in there? Is that in their family?
Yeah.
It is.
Others. Yeah, and they have some pictures of their
Their
fifth grade grandfather, their ancestors. Yeah, it's really neat. I stayed at the home of Philippe a few times in January and then this last time. And in his home, he has what they have as their coat of arms of the Vidrine family. They're a noble family, what in France were noble before the Revolution, and they're well known all throughout the area as a family of honor, of stout, if you will. Charles-Henri is a doctor in Bordeaux, and Philippe worked for Shell for many years as an executive in Europe. So they're really a great family, and it's unfortunate what happened to them.
Does Philippe read or write English?
He does. They both do. He's on Facebook too.
No, I know.
Yeah.
But-
No, he does. Like all French, they won't do it just to do it, but if they need to, they will.
Well, I've never made any comments because I didn't know what he.
Yeah. Yeah, you can send a message to him on Facebook, he would write back. In fact, we had another cousin, George Alvey Védrine, who went a few months ago, and he doesn't speak French, and so they spoke English to him,
Don't just use the translation on Facebook. That's it. That's how me and my new Vietnamese half aunt.
Yep.
So that Doisy comes from that?
It's definitely got to have a connection to that.
Because
But we don't know in Louisiana why some people started calling, one branch was Doisy, but it's definitely related to that Doisy. It's definitely. Because Etienne, the son of Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine, one of his two sons was called Lapaise. And Jean-Baptiste, his other son, wasn't. So there's a way that those names are, attributed that we still have to find out. So question becomes, after we see what he left behind, why did Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine leave France to come to Louisiana?
He received PCS orders.
That's right. There you go. Get specific, right? There is a story, as you know, of a duel that has been passed down. So this appeared in the Gazette in 1932,
Yes.
right? This was T.G. Ashlock, Jules Ashlock's dad, and Oscar Reed, and a few others. And so this was their version of the story they wrote in 1932. One day or one night, not definitely known, he found his sister and her lover in the garden. The rash and angry brother then and there demanded vengeance. In the duel, which took place on the spot, he slew the lover of his sister. To escape the vengeance of the emperor, or the sword of the dead man's kinsman, Vidrine and his sister fled to this country, and for some reason or other stopped in this vicinity and settled Villeplat. Now, this must have happened just about the time that Garand came, the founder of Villeplat. It's believed that Vidrine also brought his wife or perhaps some other members of his family with him. So this was in 1932. Well, in 2018, we're able to know that most of this is not correct. Right? This was legend. And it's important, I think, to understand that, right? In 1932, this was written, and Jules Ashlock, T.G.'s son, is the one who asked Jackie, is this true, right? What is the truth about this? And that led to Jackie's life work of giving us what we know that is not this tale, right? But what's really interesting, right, is that they thought he came straight to Villeplat, right? And that it was late, right? Garin came in 1781 after fighting for Napoleon. That it was under the Emperor of France, which indicates after the Revolution, and that he came with other people, right? All of those are false, right? He alone came, we know. Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine came. He came not, it doesn't seem because of a duel and he's fleeing his country, but to serve in the French Marines in the Louisiana Territory, which we'll talk about in a minute. He came in 1743, which was a good 60 years before the Revolution, right? And it was his son and his grandson who were here at the time of Garin and Villeplat. So Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine's two sons, Jean-Baptiste and Etienne, moved to what is today Villeplat. But they didn't come here from France, right? They came here from Washington, where they had settled at the Opelousas post. So interestingly, this same tale, broadly, is told by Philippe de Vidrine and Charles-Henri de Vidrine in terms of how they arrived at Montflanquin from the Midi, right? Or near Saint-Livrade from the Midi. So they say in their family history it was a duel that happened in the Midi that brought them to Montflanquin. These are two separate duel stories within the Vidrine family, right? Both told in terms of fleeing and going somewhere else. So it's most likely the case that that could have been what happened from the Midi that brought them to Saint-Livrade. And then when Jean-Baptiste Lapaise de Vidrine came here, he told the story and it got repeated. But when you repeat something, it oftentimes ends up wrong, right? Conflated.
Yeah.
So it was probably brought here by Jean-Baptiste Lapaise de Vidrine about his ancestors, but it got changed around. By 1932, right, it got changed to this.
Tremendously.
So we're almost certain it wasn't a duel that brought Jean-Baptiste Lapaise de Vidrine here. There's still a slight possibility it could have been the reason he joined the military, but doubtful. But more likely, it's the story of how they went from the Midi to
He may have been
Saint-Livrade.
already in the military.
Go ahead.
Well, because of the fact that they had the law of primogeniture in France, the oldest son
Correct.
inherited everything,
Correct.
and the younger sons either went to the priesthood or the
Correct.
military.
Correct.
And I think that's it, probably more than anything else.
I think it's more than that. I think that's common, and that was maybe the likely scenario. But I think, yes, Pierre, his brother, did inherit everything that we just looked at, and two of his brothers joined the Benedictine monastery, Francois and Guillaume. But I think part of it was more the whole prospect of a new world, right? Louisiana was just being founded. And there was something of an adventure in his heart, right, that wanted to go to this new world. I think it could have been more than just going to the military, because that's part of who your family, your line in the family, so to speak. But I think it was part of that was the unknown that was happening. And the king was, at that time, really trying to recruit Marines to come. So part of those, I think, informed his decision. We don't know for sure, but it's definitely a theory that could have been. So how did Jean-Baptiste Lapaise de Vidrine leave France and come to Louisiana? That's what I want to look at finally in terms of this anniversary. In France, commissioned military officers were regularly recruited from the younger sons of the gentry or occasionally from the bourgeoisie with important family or social connections among the nobility or government bureaucrats. This is a book written about the Fort de Chartres where he would serve when he came to Louisiana. But so he came as an officer, not as a common soldier. He was recruited, and he probably came either from a family that was a high end of the bourgeoisie or even noble because of their service as judges, in history throughout the town. And so he was recruited from these circumstances, right? He was recruited by King Louis XV, or at that time, among those that the king was trying to recruit to come to Louisiana Territory. It was a heavy push because of the wars against the Indians, and New Orleans was growing in the Illinois country, where the fort of Kaskaskia was growing, so they needed more soldiers. This is an interesting document. In 1742, in May, on the 29th, in which Jean-Baptiste Lapaise de Vidrine was recruited and recommended by the commander of the port at Rochefort for service in the French Marines in Louisiana as an officer. So he says there, I happily will advance Monsieur Védrines, for which you have asked, as a place within the Marines as an agulette, and within the troops that will be going to Louisiana that you asked me to do for him. So he and his family can take their preparations, make arrangements, and get ready. He will be leaving for the colony around October coming. So May 29, 1742, He had just turned 30 years old on May 12th, and he's recruited to serve in the military. So this Mr. Barria was, as I said, the commander of the Marines at Rochefort, but somebody is recommending to Barria that he be an officer in the Marines. So the commander is saying, happily acquiesce, if you will, to this request that Védrine be a cadet d'Aguilette for the troops in Louisiana. So he was recommended by someone, and he gets accepted. This is a list of cadets that they had recruited through the years, and you can see on October 29th of 1742, so this is a few months after May, Védrine is a cadet d'Aguilette destined for New Orleans. And they misspelled his name, they put Vidrine, so they scratched out here and put Védrine.
How many times?
So it's been done throughout history, right, all the time. But by October 29, 1742, he was recruited. He was actually commissioned as a cadet d'Aguilette, destined for New Orleans, the territory. So, this book about the Port de Chartres says virtually every company of the Marines contained one or more cadets who were young men in training to become officers. Cadets served in the ranks with common soldiers, so they were marked out from the first for eventual promotion. Bright, ambitious cadets might be assigned to study engineering. The higher the status of a cadet's family, or the greater the influence of an official willing to intervene on his behalf, the shorter the time the cadet was likely to spend before commissioning, provided there was a vacancy to fill. Cadet might serve only a few months before promotion, or more than a decade. The usual term was about 3 to 6 years. There were two types of cadets: the cadet d'Aguilette, so called because he wore an aiguillette, a shoulder cord. Cadets d'Aguilette also were referred to as gentlemen cadets, were of higher social status and usually received earlier promotion than the cadets of lesser status, who were designated simply as cadet soldats. Cadets were frequently sons of officers. So we're able to know a few things about this, I think, about Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine. First of all, he was recommended by someone, right? Brought forward. There was some ambition in him, right, to discover a new world, I think. He did come from the upper end of society, if you will, as his family in Saint-Lévrard had been part of the noblesse, the robe, the judges. He was not a son of an officer. He was a son of a lawyer. But he was recruited as a cadet d'Aguilette, which meant when he signed up, he would be an officer. He would not be a regular soldier. Right? So it's interesting to consider, right? How he came recruited and recommended. So this is a drawing of the French Marines, and specifically the cadet d'Aguilette. That's the shoulder cord that we talk about, right, that they wore. So he served as a cadet d'Aguilette, coming to Louisiana for about 6 years, and in New Orleans was made an officer before being sent up to the Fort de Chartres. But he was a cadet d'Aguilette. Let's see. So this is the passenger list that was created for the actual ship that Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine came on, the Charente. So the list of the persons who were granted passage according to the fleet of the king, the Charente, which is destined for Louisiana. And on the top of the list is Monsieur de Vaudreuil, the governor of New Orleans. So he was the new governor appointed by the king to govern New Orleans. I think it's difficult for us to understand how big this was. The first governor of New Orleans, Bienville, who had been governor for 3 terms, was finally stepping down because of age, and Governor Vaudreuil was coming to take his place. So that's why I think there's something in Jean-Baptiste de Vidrine that saw something was happening in Louisiana, right, that he wanted to maybe be part of. But he is listed among the top of the cadets d'Aguilette. That's Sieur de Védrines right there, cadet d'Aguilette, and there are a few others with him. But on the ship, at least according to the passenger list, there were only about 41 people and some other servants that are not listed on the passenger list, right? But 41 people, and this was made on November 26, 1742. So November 26, 1742, the list is made, and the Charente is getting ready to sail to New Orleans. So think about that, right? He was recommended in May. He was commissioned by October. They had this list made in November of the passengers, and the ship was supposed to set sail shortly after this. However, there were some delays. Different things happened, and it didn't actually leave the port of Rochefort until January 1st, 1743, New Year's Day, 1743. So a few months after the list was made. So you can imagine the excitement or the anticipation in Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine and his family even, as he's, for the first time in our branch of the Vidrine family, going out of France to the New World. And he's there on the ship with the new governor of New Orleans. So this is Vaudreuil, or at least a drawing of him. And Vaudreuil was from France, had served in Canada, and then was appointed to be the new governor in New Orleans of the Louisiana Territory. He was very successful as a governor in Louisiana by all historical accounts. He was known to be of noble character, but also did a lot of good for those who were poor. There were a lot of poor in those days in New Orleans, just founded. But he lived a high life. There were grand balls in New Orleans in his time. They almost called New Orleans the Paris of Louisiana, right? In his time, he had grand balls and great festivities. So Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Védrines served under Governor Vaudreuil for about 8 years in New Orleans. When he went to New Orleans, as long as Vaudreuil was governor, he was in New Orleans. When Vaudreuil was reassigned, Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine went to Fort Richard in Illinois. Right? So his time in New Orleans is with Vaudreuil, and he came on the ship with Vaudreuil. We have images of the drawings of the Charente, the ship that he came on. Jackie was able to find in the archives, and this is the front of the ship as it was designed to be. This is the rear of the ship, and you can see there La Charente. We don't know if the ship was built exactly this way, because sometimes there were drawings and then they weren't, but the majority of the ships were built according to the drawings, right? So this could be it is the Charente, but it could be what it looked like, the ship that he came on to Louisiana, right? Pretty incredible. They departed from Rochefort, France, which is on the coast of France, north of Bordeaux. It's where the center of the Marines were in France. The administrative offices were there, and it's a port city not far from La Rochelle. La Rochelle was a little north of Rochefort, but La Rochelle is where a lot of the Acadians left France to go to Canada, right? But Rochefort's a little south, and it was more military as a port. And that's where Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine left on the Charente from Rochefort. It's a drawing of Rochefort being loaded. Another drawing of it, you can see the flurry of activity, right? Loading the ships and getting ready to go. The military buildings there in Rochefort. Pretty amazing because they're still standing in Rochefort, right? It's today a museum of the ropes that were built through time in the Marines, but drawn in about 1670, right? And actual still living or still existing. The head of the Marines, their headquarters, is now the Museum of the French Marines, and so it's a really great museum that kind of details their history, the models of the ships that they had, and they actually built a ship just a few years ago that Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, came to. It's called the Hermoine, and it sits there at Rochefort, and every now and then we'll take some journeys around the world. It came to America just a few years ago, across the ocean, and it just arrived back at Rochefort before I got there. But,
In fact, they have a Facebook page, I follow it. I
Yeah,
followed the
but
whole,
it's neat.
it's neat.
Neat to walk on it and to see it. But the journey that took place across the sea was about 4 months long. They departed on January 1st, 1743, and they arrived in New Orleans at the beginning of May. So about 4 months. Imagine being on a ship for about 4 months across the ocean. It's not very difficult. It's not very easy. Of course, there were not many on the Charente. We saw about 41 passengers and then some servants. Very, very different than the stories you hear of the Acadians being loaded onto ships as animals, really, and loaded by the hundreds. So it was a good voyage by all accounts that we have. A lot of times the ships were attacked by the English or encountered terrible weather, but as far as we know, according to the logbook that has been found of one of the ships that accompanied it, it was good. So the passage went from Rochefort here, right? Let me enlarge a little bit. So from Rochefort here to Saint-Domingue, and then from Saint-Domingue to New Orleans, right? There's a map drawn about the time that Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine came over, but you can see the journey really. So they left on January 1st, 1743, and they docked the first week of April in Saint-Domingue, which today is Haiti, and they were there for about a week and a half. So this was Saint-Domingue, today Haiti, but in the days of Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Védrines, the Cap was here, Cap François, the capital, and it was described as a mini Paris. Saint-Domingue was a very prosperous territory of the Louisiana government. And this is where they first grew sugar before Louisiana and other goods. But they stopped here for about a week and a half, and according to the accounts given, Governor Vaudreuil received a very lavish reception here as the new governor of Louisiana. The captain of the ship later requested from the Marines to be reimbursed for the expenses, and it was a lot of expenses, right? So it was a very lavish greeting, and so Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine took part in that stop off the ship. Actually, one of the Marines recruited with him as a cadet, the Aguilette, was left behind. He couldn't find him when they were leaving, and either he deserted or he got lost, but he did not get back on the ship to go to New Orleans.
That's where he got some of his names.
So Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine did not desert or get lost on Saint-Domingue, right? So this is Saint-Domingue and Cap François, kind of the perspective from the ocean as you would, as you would approach there, and then the layout of the town. You can see the church and the plaza. It really was a prosperous town for the French colony, and they spent about a week and a half there. They set sail about the second week of April, and about 3 days into their journey to New Orleans from Saint-Domingue was Easter. They celebrated Easter on the ship. And this is a map drawn of Louisiana in 1732 and then published in 1752. So the reason I put it here is this is the time Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Védrines is coming to Louisiana, and you can see there is no Opelousas Post. Opelousas Post is not on the map, right? New Orleans is on the map near Lake Pontchartrain.
What year was that?
1732, but published in 1752. So La Nouvelle Orleans is there, and you go up the Mississippi a little bit. There's the Fort of Pankapee.
That's the map.
Is
You have the Avoyelles.
Yeah.
What's that?
Takapa?
Takapa? Nope, the Takapa is not.
Okay.
It's not on the map yet.
Okay, but into
It would be, it would be about over here, and it's not here. Some of the Indians are mentioned, right, but the Takapa or Opelousas are not on the map. So just think about that a little bit, right? Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine is leaving France, which had been in existence for centuries, and even the places he was associated with had been there for centuries, coming to a place that where he would finally settle was not even on the map, right? Talk about ambition to start something new, right? So this blows at least what was written in 1732 about the duel out of the water, right? When he arrived, there was no built by or Aloysius Post.
Okay, so what year exactly was Aloysius Post?
Well, you had settlers of the Aloysius Post around 1750.
Yeah, but Tulane has a, big thing, you know how y'all have the listing?
Yeah.
They have a thing, I wanna contact them, because they have, land grants that are showing for 1721.
Yeah, there were, but the
But I
Spanish
wonder if
government
there's-
didn't recognize them
No,
when they came.
so that's why the society over there wants to.
And I'm not saying there were not settlers in here, but there was definitely no post or no organized
I know,
settlement.
so-
You would have maybe had some people living in the woods.
Yeah, yeah, that's not.
Yeah, that's an earlier map, that's
Yeah.
before the Spanish.
Yeah, see, so that's what I'm thinking.
This was a depiction of the Fort de Balize at the entrance of the Mississippi. So when you would come to New Orleans, this is what you would arrive at, the Fort de Balize. Boats would dock there and probably take another boat up the Mississippi to New Orleans. Sometimes the boats went up, but sometimes they docked there. So Lapaise was a fort, and it's no longer in existence. There's a partial land still there in the water, but nothing remains of what it was. So they arrived on May 8th, 1743 at Lapaise here. And there was a cannon salute to the new governor, and this is where it was here. And what they did is traveled up the Mississippi to New Orleans, all the way up to there. So if you've ever gone on a cruise out of New Orleans, you know it takes a little while to get down the Mississippi, right? To go down. It took 2 days for Jean-Baptiste and his crew to get up. They went up, and by May 10th, Governor Védrines had arrived in New Orleans. The summer, right at the beginning of the heat, right? Imagine going from France to Louisiana for the first time as Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine and getting down in the humidity and heat, right? And saying, what did I do? So, this is a map of New Orleans that was drawn in about 5 years after Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine had arrived. This was drawn in around 1747 or 8, and this is what New Orleans looked like when he arrived. He was actually in New Orleans when this map was drawn, right? So you have there, of course, St. Louis Cathedral, the Church of St. Louis at the time, the Place des Armes, which is today Jackson Square, and the city laid out, which is essentially the French Quarter, right, in New Orleans. All of New Orleans that we know today was all woods, as you can see. Plantations and woods. But the Fleuve Saint Louis is the Mississippi. There was a few settlements on the other side near Algiers and the West Bank. But this was New Orleans when Jean-Baptiste Lapaise was
It's funny how Saint Domingue and New Orleans built their city the same way.
Yeah, well, it was the pattern of it.
I just noticed that when you showed the two maps.
So if you've ever been to the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans, that's the old Ursuline Convent. It was built a few years after Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine arrived. So he arrived in 1743, and the plans for the new Ursuline Convent started in 1745 and was built by 1751. And they told us when I visited there this year for the tricentennial that it was built by the French Marines. So who knows if he was part of the building as an officer or not, we don't know. But it was constructed during his time, right? And he knew it. You could see the old construction. And actually in New Orleans, they say this is the oldest building standing in New Orleans, the old Ursuline Convent. And the old staircase, that's original, built in 1745 to 1751. So this was built during Jean-Baptiste Lapaise of Vidrine's time. So 275 years ago, he arrived in New Orleans on May 10th, 1743, and then his life in Louisiana began, which would then go on to include marrying a bride at the Fort de Chartres, then coming back down to South Louisiana and settling at the Lapaise post, which was Washington. And then his two sons were moved toward today what is Ville Platte, Take Cove area, and the Vidrine family would grow. Right? So from one came the thousands of Vidrines. His journey was very, very different from the Acadians who came down in the other parts of Louisiana, right? He was not deported. He came as a Marine. He didn't come on a ship with hundreds. He came with a ship of about 41 and a few servants. He came to New Orleans and served honorably the Marines and retired and then established a family farming in Louisiana. So it's pretty incredible that we can know the details that we know.
You said he was 30 when you came over?
He was 30 when he was recruited, and he was about 70, or 68 when he retired. He was much older than his bride. He married a young girl, and she lived about 20 years after him. When he came. So this is a video I'll show you. Let me see.
Is there any evidence in Washington of Vidrines coming there?
We do have, well, we have the maps of where his land was, and we know where his land was, and then his name is written there, and that's about all that we have, though. It's still farmland. Nothing's built on where he settled and farmed.
Vidrines Cemetery.
Actually, if you cross over the exit after the Washington exit, which is the Lapaise overpass, you look to the left, all that area was where he settled in Washington. That was where he was at the
All the way
Lapaise.
on the left?
Yeah, all the way back to Grand Prairie, really. So I was going to show you this. It's in French, and I had a speaker, but it doesn't look like it's connecting. But I think you'll be able to hear it. I'll translate it for you, but it's Olivier Casteja who's recording a video saying it's a great joy to visit with Jason today in the Chateau d'Oisy Vidrine. It's always a joy to receive Vidrine ancestors who come here to where their family was. Ever since Druid and Jackie first went, and he gave the key to Druid, he's always joyfully received people from the Vidrine family. And it's always been a great relation with the Vidrine family since then. You're always welcome to come to the chateau. I hope that you have a great reunion in October of the 275th anniversary of the Vidrine family in Louisiana. And I hope that the next anniversary we are able to have a reunion here at the Chateau d'Oisy Vidrine in France for all Vidrine members in Louisiana, as well as the Vidrines in France, in Bordeaux, and with the Casteja family. So there's an open invitation, right, to have a Vidrine reunion for the 300th anniversary, tricentennial, the next anniversary, but really whatever we would want that he would host at the
Yeah, I probably did.
But it's amazing, really. That would be amazing to be able to do, right? For those who would be able to. So, any questions or?
Thank you, Bob. When did Druid and Jackie go?
They went for the first time in 1970, around 70, 71. Yeah. And she had done some work before that, but then it took them that long to find out that belonged to our family and to actually make the connection and get there. Around 1970. Actually, Jacques, who died, their son, spent a summer at the Chateau one summer as a boy. So they established a great relationship, right? And But she did a lot of the work in the 60s, 70s, and then published a book in 81, and then continued her research, right, until to the end.
She was a substitute teacher at Philpott.
Yeah.
She taught us
And my mother too.
smokes to do. Did us
She was an amazing historian, amazing historian. She did some uncovering, and the stories are that Druid would visit the people, and shoot the bull. Jackie was doing the research, right, in the libraries and in the municipal buildings. It's just amazing, really, that you can trace the details that we have of the Vidrine family. Not a lot of families can do that.
No, we cannot.
To know the voyage, to know where he came from, to know what we had, to know what he left behind. Good record. When he arrived. And there's drama, of course, in the Vidrine family history, as you know. There's the stories of the coat of arms and the history being thrown into the fire over a dispute within the family. We don't know how true that is, but along the way, a lot of it was lost in terms of what we knew. And so by 1932, when that article was written, there was a lot of misunderstanding, right, about how it came here.
Well, thank you so much, Father James. We really enjoyed it.
You're welcome.
That was very good.
Very, very good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna continue with some business here. First of all, we have door prizes that everybody, Paula's gonna, get in